The email had arrived on a Tuesday morning, titled Discussion Panel on Youth in Politics. It was addressed formally to Karoline Leavitt, inviting her to appear as a guest on a special edition of The Daily Show. The show's producers described it as an honest, respectful conversation between generations about the role of young voices in the future of American politics. But Karoline wasn't naive. She'd seen this tactic before, a media invite dressed in civility, but sharpened underneath with condescension. She remembered how rising conservative voices had been framed, cornered, even ridiculed on late-night shows. Still, she didn't flinch. She never did. She accepted. Because Karoline had something to prove, not just to Jon Stewart, not just to the audience, but to every young woman who'd been laughed at, sidelined, or told that her resume wasn't enough. Backstage, the studio was buzzing. Cameras were being adjusted. A producer with a clipboard asked Karoline to stay loose and open to humor. Another assistant subtly reminded her, "Jon likes to keep it playful. Don't take anything too seriously." Karoline smiled politely, but she knew what that meant. They were preparing her to be the punchline. Her team had warned her, "They'll try to make a meme out of you." But Karoline had prepared too, and not just with talking points. She had compiled a folder of hard receipts, job records, policy briefs she'd authored, memos she'd contributed to while working in the Trump White House, and even a few internal emails that had never seen the light of day. She'd brought her resume, all right, but not the kind you list on LinkedIn. This was the kind you read out loud when someone tries to diminish who you are on national TV. The lights dimmed, the show intro began, and Jon Stewart, back behind the desk after years away, leaned forward with his signature grin, the crowd erupting around him. Karoline walked out, head high, heels hitting the stage with purpose. The applause was measured, polite, curious, but not yet respectful. Not yet. She shook his hand. He gestured toward the chair with exaggerated chivalry. "Ladies first," he said with a smirk. She sat. And then he leaned back, raised one eyebrow, and said the line that would spark the storm. "So, Karoline, tell me again why you're qualified to speak on any of this?" The audience chuckled. Karoline didn't. She slowly reached for the folder beside her, and America had no idea what was coming next. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't snap back or throw a sarcastic jab. That wasn't her game. Instead, she kept her eyes locked on Jon Stewart and calmly placed the folder onto the table between them with the kind of deliberate motion that felt out of place on a comedy set. The audience, still chuckling, hesitated for a beat. Something had shifted. Jon leaned forward slightly, curious. "What's that?" he asked, still half smirking. Karoline looked straight into the camera. "This," she said, "is what I've done while everyone was too busy laughing at my resume." She opened the folder. Page 1. A policy memo she'd authored during her time in the Trump administration. Not some ceremonial assistant task, but a detailed internal briefing that helped inform national messaging during the COVID reopening phase. Her name, clearly listed in the contributors section. Jon blinked. The crowd, once lighthearted, was now quieter. Page 2. A signed letter from a congressman thanking her for her instrumental role in coordinating youth outreach strategies during the midterms. Strategies that flipped a handful of tight districts red. Page 3. Emails, not leaked, not stolen, but real, verifiable communications showing her involvement in legislative briefings with top staffers. Her fingerprint was on more policies than they expected, more than anyone in that room was ready to admit. "See, Jon," she continued, "I know what this seat was meant to be. I was brought here because I'm young, conservative, and unapologetic. You assumed that meant unqualified, but I didn't come here to argue with you. I came here to document something." She placed the last page down, a data report co-authored with 2 Harvard fellows on youth political engagement. Peer-reviewed, cited. Jon's grin had faded. For the first time in the segment, he seemed unsure. "Well," he chuckled awkwardly, "I guess you did your homework." Karoline smiled, but not smugly. "No, Jon. This isn't homework. This is history. Mine. And I brought it so the next girl who gets laughed at doesn't walk into the room empty-handed." That landed. The audience, still unsure whether they were in a comedy segment or a reckoning, gave a scattered applause. One woman in the front row leaned forward, whispering to the person beside her, "She's not what I expected." Jon, trying to regain his footing, leaned back and said, all right. Let's talk about that Trump job. Was that real influence or glorified intern?" Karoline didn't even blink. "It was real," she said. "And if you'd like, I can show you the emails your researchers left out." The audience gasped. And just like that, Jon realized this wasn't going to be the segment they'd planned. The cameras kept rolling, but something intangible had broken in the studio. The segment had been pitched as a playful debate, a generational jab at a young conservative figure rising in Republican circles. The plan was simple: lean on Stewart's wit, let the crowd do the rest, and give Karoline enough rope to hang herself rhetorically. But the rope was now in her hands, and she wasn't tying a noose. She was building a bridge. Jon shuffled the cue cards in front of him, a clear tell that things were off script. "Okay," he said, reaching for levity. "You're clearly very proud of all that paperwork, Karoline. But policy memos and email chains don't necessarily mean you've got the experience to speak on the same stage as you," Karoline cut in smoothly. "That's fine, but let's not pretend this chair was offered in good faith." That caught him off guard. "You mean the invite?" Jon asked. "I mean the framing," she replied. "This entire show was meant to poke fun at someone like me. Young, female, Republican. You thought I'd sit here, flinch, laugh awkwardly, and take your jokes as compliments. That I'd play along and thank you for the exposure," the crowd murmured. Jon raised a brow. "And you didn't?" Karoline's voice didn't rise, but it tightened. "Number I came to tell the truth. Not just about me, but about how voices like mine get filtered through people like you. You call it satire. I call it deflection." A ripple of unease rolled through the studio. The audience wasn't sure if they were supposed to laugh or listen. Jon leaned forward. "Okay then, what truth are we not telling?" Karoline took a breath. "The truth is, millions of Americans, especially young conservatives, don't see themselves in your jokes anymore. You punch down more than you admit. You condescend when you claim to be curious. And when someone like me walks into your space with facts instead of catchphrases, you scramble." It was a daring moment. Cameras captured Jon's silence, not of defeat, but of reassessment. He wasn't used to guests taking control. Karoline had changed the tone entirely. This wasn't a roast, it was a reversal. "You wanted a soundbite," she said finally. "But I didn't come for that. I came to show receipts. And I'm not done." The audience, perhaps for the first time, applauded not out of obligation, but out of genuine reaction. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. Jon sat back. "All right then, let's see what you've got." And Karoline smiled. Not to provoke, but to prepare. Because the folder still had pages left. Karoline reached for the folder again, her hand steady as ever. She didn't need permission. The stage might have been Jon's, the lights, the script, the audience. But the story? That was hers now. And every page she turned was another brick pulled from the wall they'd built around her. "This next one," she said, sliding a laminated page into view, "is from the Department of Education." Jon tried to interject with a joke, but she pressed forward. "I was 25 when I co-authored this draft memo on parental rights in education. It was shelved. Why? Because I fought for transparency on curriculum content. And that didn't fit the administration's narrative." The audience stiffened. Jon cleared his throat. "That sounds a little conspiratorial." Karoline didn't blink. "I brought the time-stamped emails. You're welcome to read them on air." Another gasp. She turned to the audience. Not the camera, not Jon. "I know what it's like to walk into a room where no one wants to hear you, only to disprove you, where your credentials are questioned before you've even opened your mouth." Her voice didn't shake. It was deliberate, personal. "Most of you don't have to bring proof of your accomplishments to a conversation. I do. Because the default assumption, especially in mainstream spaces, is that if you're young and conservative, you must be misinformed, manipulated, or mad." She pulled another page. a signed op-ed from a left-leaning academic citing her youth engagement data from 2022. It wasn't just that she had experience. It was that it had already been acknowledged by people her critics respected. Jon leaned back, visibly wrestling with how to proceed. His show had featured activists, whistleblowers, senators, but no one had ever done this. No one had hijacked the narrative mid-show and dared him to keep up. Karoline looked at him. "I was told you'd be fair." He paused. "And I am." "Then let's be fair. Let's talk about why people like me don't get booked unless someone wants a viral clash." It was raw, not rehearsed, lived. The audience now sat in stunned silence. Not because Karoline had won, but because she had rewritten the rules of engagement. On their turf. She closed the folder slowly. "I've got nothing else to prove. But if we're going to debate, let's make it real." Jon nodded, slowly, respectfully, and, for once, without a joke. Something had shifted in the air. The applause sign above the audience blinked, but no one was watching it anymore. They weren't laughing. They weren't waiting for punchlines. They were simply watching, intently, uncomfortably, and undeniably. Karoline sat forward, no longer defensive, no longer proving. She had made her case. Now, she was asking questions. "Why is it," she began, her gaze steady on Jon, "that when a young woman stands for traditional values, she's mocked, but when she stands for progressive ones, she's celebrated?" Jon tried to pivot. "Isn't that a little—" "No," she cut in. "It's not a theory. It's my reality. I've lived both reactions in the same 24-hour news cycle, same platform, different beliefs, and the treatment flips overnight." A murmur of agreement rose from a corner of the audience. Karoline didn't acknowledge it directly, but she felt it. She continued. "I was mocked for my faith on a morning show, then invited to a serious political roundtable the next day, only because I trended. Not because I was heard, but because I was attacked." She paused and looked to the crowd. "Don't you see the game?" The audience, once primed to clap at every Jon Stewart zinger, now found themselves considering her words instead of reacting. She had flipped the format. This wasn't an interview. This was an interrogation of the platform itself. And everyone in the room was part of it. Jon softened. "Look, I think you're brave. I don't agree with a lot of what you say, but I admire your willingness to come here." Karoline tilted her head. "Admiration without honesty is just condescension with a bow on top." That stung. And it landed. Jon raised his hand slightly. "Okay, so what do you want from this conversation?" Karoline looked dead into the camera. "I want the same thing anyone sitting in your chair wants. To be heard without a laugh track. To speak without someone queuing up a meme. To challenge ideas without being edited down to a facial reaction." It was her strongest moment yet. No folder. No document. Just her voice. And a truth too sharp to dismiss. Jon nodded, more measured now. "That's fair." The crowd nodded too. And for the first time in the entire segment, Karoline Leavitt, the girl whose resume they once laughed at, wasn't just part of the discussion, she was leading it. There was something strange, almost surreal, about the silence that followed. In a studio built for quick laughs and clever cuts, quiet wasn't normal. But Karoline had earned it, not by force, not by volume, by sheer, unwavering presence. Jon leaned back in his chair, not defensively, contemplatively. The smugness that had accompanied his opening jabs was gone, replaced now by something rarer: self-awareness. "You said earlier that this wasn't a good faith invite," he said, his tone subdued. "But you still came. Why?" Karoline didn't flinch. "Because real conservatives don't run from uncomfortable spaces. We walk in knowing the odds, and speak anyway." The room stilled. "I knew what this was," she continued. "A setup. But sometimes you walk straight into the ambush, not to survive it, but to flip it. To show people watching at home that they're not alone, that they don't need permission to speak up." Jon swallowed visibly. His audience was watching, but it was he who now felt on display. Karoline stood slowly, stepping around the table, not to grandstand, but to address the viewers more directly. It was unorthodox, unrehearsed. Yet not a single crew member intervened. Not a single producer waved her down. She looked at the crowd. They told me I'd regret this. The audience waited. They told me I'd be edited, misquoted, ridiculed. She scanned the studio. But I didn't come for them. I came for the girl sitting at home, watching this on her phone, the one who's told she's too conservative to be taken seriously, who's mocked for quoting the Constitution, who's made to believe that if she ever speaks, she'll be laughed off the stage. Karoline's voice softened. I came here so she wouldn't feel alone. There was no applause sign flashing now, and yet the audience began to clap, slowly at first, then louder. It wasn't performative, it was reflexive. The kind of applause that happens when conviction meets clarity. Jon stood up too. You flipped this segment upside down. Karoline turned back to him. Number I just said what you weren't ready to hear. He extended a hand. Fair. She shook it, not as a gesture of surrender, but of challenge accepted. The camera panned out. The segment, intended to corner her, had instead become something else entirely. A mirror. And it was Jon Stewart's own show reflecting back at him. From the eyes of the very person they underestimated, the handshake lingered longer than either expected. It wasn't just a gesture of professionalism. It was something else. Mutual recognition. Two people who had entered a space on opposite ends of a narrative, now realizing that the story wasn't as clean-cut as either had presumed. Karoline returned to her seat, not to retreat, but to expand. There was still more to say, and now the floor was undeniably hers. I think it's time we stop pretending this divide is about facts, she said, her voice unwavering. It's about frames. The way conversations are framed before they even begin. You didn't bring me here because you were curious, Jon. You brought me here because you thought I could be cornered. The crowd murmured. And that's the game, isn't it? She continued. You bring someone on who challenges the prevailing worldview, not to debate them, but to dismantle them, to turn them into a punchline before they even get to speak. Jon raised an eyebrow. So, you think this was a trap? Karoline didn't hesitate. I know it was. You brought up my resume like it was a joke. But I've worked jobs most of your producers wouldn't last a day in. I've knocked doors in 110-degree heat for congressional candidates. I've written legislation that never got credit. I've stood backstage while someone else took the mic because they thought I was too young, too blonde, too conservative to speak. She paused, but here I am. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was thick, electric. Even Jon, seasoned in the rhythm of studio timing, didn't dare interrupt, because this wasn't a moment to be managed. It was a moment to be witnessed. Karoline pulled something from the inside of her blazer. A worn note, folded in half. She opened it gently and placed it on the table between them. This, she said, was from a mentor who told me, if they laugh at your resume, let them. But make sure they never forget what you say. Jon glanced at the paper. There was no logo, no letterhead, just handwriting, bold, italic, sharp, like Karoline herself. She smiled slightly. So, if I was just acting, as you joked earlier, this would have been my closing scene. Jon sat forward, genuinely interested now. But it's not? No, she said, because I'm not done, and I don't need a script. The audience didn't cheer. Not yet. But you could feel it coming. Something had broken open in the room. And no one, not even Jon Stewart, could pretend otherwise. The girl they'd invited to poke fun at? She'd just claimed the whole chair and rewrote the rules of the stage. The studio lights had warmed slightly. Or maybe it was the energy. A shift had occurred. One that couldn't be undone, no matter how tightly the post-production editors might later try to splice it. Karoline had crossed an invisible line, not just into dominance, but into authorship. This wasn't Jon Stewart's segment anymore. It was hers. Jon leaned in, elbows on the desk, fingers loosely interlaced. So if you're not acting, he said slowly, then what are you doing? Karoline glanced at the camera and then at him. I'm documenting, in real time, the way young conservatives are portrayed, and the way we fight back. She pulled a slim flash drive from her inner jacket pocket and held it up. This has everything. The interviews that never aired. The policy papers we submitted that got lost. The quotes they clipped mid-sentence. You want to talk about performance? The real performance is pretending those stories don't exist. The room was silent again, but now it felt like it was listening. See, she continued, you call it acting when someone like me prepares. When we bring evidence, when we bring a backbone. But if a left-leaning guest memorizes a monologue, you call it passion. You praise it as advocacy. Jon didn't respond. He was listening too now, perhaps more closely than he ever had during a guest's appearance. Because something about Karoline's delivery wasn't just persuasive. It was undeniable. She placed the flash drive on the table, right next to her water glass. A deliberate move. She wasn't handing it over. She was planting it. I won't beg anyone to believe me, she said. I'll let the record speak. And then came the moment no one expected, not even Karoline herself. A young woman in the studio audience stood up. She's right, she said softly. Everyone turned. I interned for a state senator last year. When I said I leaned conservative, they put me in the back room to write constituent letters. Wouldn't even let me near the legislative process. Said I'd embarrass the office. Jon's jaw tightened. Not from anger, from impact. Karoline met the woman's eyes. And yet here you are, speaking anyway. The girl nodded. Because of you. That was the moment. The audience didn't erupt into applause. Not yet. But they all knew they were no longer just watching a segment. They were part of something bigger. Karoline turned back to Jon. You wanted a performance? You got a movement. He nodded slowly, the humor now long gone from his tone. Maybe I misjudged you. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. I'm used to it. And with that, she leaned back. The flash drive still on the table. The words still hanging in the air. And the mic still very much on. By the time the stage manager flashed the silent wrap-up signal from behind the camera, no one moved. Not Jon, not Karoline, not even the control booth. The red live indicator had been off for 3 minutes, but no one dared to interrupt the atmosphere. It felt like desecration to break a moment that raw. Karoline finally reached forward, not to grab her water, but to gather the flash drive she had placed down so deliberately. She didn't pocket it. Instead, she stood up, walked across the studio floor, and gently handed it to the intern who had spoken up from the audience. The girl hesitated, then clutched it like it was a torch. You don't have to be behind the desk to make history, Karoline said to her quietly, but it was loud enough for the mic to pick up. Jon watched this unfold without trying to interrupt or inject a quip. His face had shifted completely from the smug host to something else, a man confronted by a reality he wasn't expecting. For years, he had crafted a persona of intellect, skepticism, and satire, but in this moment, he was simply a man who had underestimated the wrong guest. Karoline, he said, standing now too. If you don't mind me asking, what was your goal coming here? Karoline turned toward him with calm conviction. Not to win. I'm not here for applause. I came to remind people that not everyone with values needs validation from a green room full of producers. You wanted to be heard? Number I wanted to remind you that we've been speaking. You just haven't been listening. Jon ran a hand down his beard. That's fair. There was something dignified about his honesty. And Karoline didn't exploit it. She nodded, as if recognizing a quiet truce had formed, not of agreement, but of respect. A producer finally stepped forward from the wings. We've got what we need, she said hesitantly. We'll take it to editing. Karoline stopped her with a glance. I'd prefer it be released uncut. The producer blinked. That's not standard, Karoline shrugged. Neither is truth. But it's what this audience deserves. Then came the murmur, first from one row, then another. The audience, no longer divided by allegiance, but unified in astonishment, began to clap. Jon raised his hand to the producer. Let it run, raw, no edits. She looked at him, surprised. You sure? He nodded. She earned it. Karoline turned toward the studio exit. As she walked off, the cameras still rolling unofficially, the intern shouted after her, What should I do with the flash drive? Karoline smiled over her shoulder. Upload it. Let everyone see what they weren't supposed to. That line would end up trending by midnight. By the time Karoline stepped out into the late evening air, her phone was already buzzing. Mentions, reposts, raw screen captures of the unedited interview, all flooding social media like a tidal wave of collective awakening. The clip of her handing the flash drive to the intern had been uploaded, not by a network, not by a press outlet, by the intern herself. Under the caption, "They said young conservatives should stay silent." Karoline didn't. In under an hour, it had crossed 4 million views. By dawn, it would hit 30. But numbers weren't what marked the moment. It was what those numbers meant. Karoline had gone on a show known for slicing guests to shreds, especially guests like her, and had turned it into a reckoning. She hadn't just defended her resume. She had made every word on it count. Jon Stewart, for his part, posted one simple tweet: "I brought receipts." She brought the record. The quote was humble, honest, and most of all, true. It went viral on its own. That tweet alone ignited a thread from young voters across the country who had once felt politically homeless. Not moderate, not indifferent, just uninvited. And now, because of Karoline, they had seen someone walk onto a national platform and refuse to perform, refuse to bend, and refuse to be reduced. The intern, whose name was Sophie, received thousands of messages overnight, some offering interviews, others just thanking her for speaking up. One message read, "I'm a Democrat, but after seeing that, I realized I don't want to mock people into silence anymore. I want to listen, the way Karoline made me listen." Karoline, in her hotel room, watched all of it unfold in silence. She didn't celebrate. She didn't repost. She just sat at the edge of the bed, watching the screen flood with faces she'd never met. Young, old, unsure, but paying attention. When her phone rang again, it was a journalist from a rival network. They wanted her for a morning segment. "What's the angle?" she asked. "We want to know how you stayed so calm when Jon came at your resume." Karolina paused, then answered with the same voice that had filled the studio. "Because I don't build my confidence on approval. I build it on truth." The line would become another headline. She closed the phone, stood, and walked to the window. The city lights pulsed like a heartbeat, alive, chaotic, unpredictable, just like the country she was fighting for. And far below, somewhere in the swirl of that night, someone was watching the clip for the first time. And someone else was whispering, "Maybe it's time I speak too." Because one resume might be mocked, but one voice, if used right, it could change everything. What you just witnessed wasn't just a clash on a talk show. It was a shift in the conversation. Jon Stewart thought he brought another guest to challenge. Instead, he met someone who challenged him. Karoline Leavitt didn't come with credentials designed to impress TV elites. She came with facts, with purpose, with receipts. And when they tried to laugh her off the stage, she didn't flinch. She documented everything. In an era where narratives are manufactured and silence is sold as civility, Karoline didn't just defend her name. She showed a generation that standing firm with truth can still silence a room, even when the odds are stacked against you. If you believe voices like hers deserve to be heard, unfiltered, uncut, and unshaken, then don't just watch. Share it. Say it. Stand up. Because tonight wasn't just a segment, it was a warning to anyone still underestimating her. She didn't need the resume you approved. She brought the one that counted.